Let's spend time in the Bible. The Bible's a good thing. Let's spend time in the Word this morning. We have been working our way through the Gospel of John, which has been a really interesting and yet challenging at the same time, even challenging gospel as we look at and as we hear and as we see the stories as they are portrayed and as they have been shared with us, as they are being communicated to us through the words of John, and just in terms of who is Jesus? And how do we come to know Jesus? And what does John want us to know about who Jesus is and how he works and how he operates and how he functions and what all of that looks like? I'm going to go ahead and read our text this morning. We're sort of getting to a point where I seem to be running out of people who are willing to make videos and read. So the last couple of weeks, you've been hearing me reading our text more often than not. And that's just sort of where we are, and that's okay. So I'm going to invite you, let's go ahead and turn to John chapter 12 this morning. John chapter 12 is where we are at, where we're going. Going a little bit backwards in terms of where we have been in the overall Jesus timeline, and that's A-okay. I'll get to that, and I'll explain that a little bit too here in a minute. John chapter 12, starting at verse 1, Jesus anointed at Bethany. Here's what we read. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. Meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there and came not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well, for on account of him, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and believing in him. So we are at a point now in the church calendar, a point now in the church year where it's crunch time. Oftentimes in a lot of my conversations with people, I'll say, this is basically kind of like Super Bowl season for the church. Because if you think about it, that's what Easter Sunday is for the church, for Christians. Easter Sunday is like our Super Bowl Sunday. It's the big day. It's the reason why it is that we worship, why we gather on Sundays in particular for worship and for church. So we are very much approaching crunch time, as I might say. Next Sunday is Palm Sunday. And then after Palm Sunday, then we have Good Friday, and then we're on to Easter Sunday. And as we've been going through the Gospel of John, we've been a little bit out of order. We haven't been taking this strictly in chronological order, the way that might make sense in our minds and the way we might be accustomed to or think about or think is the most helpful or the most beneficial way to do it. But that's because John really spreads out his conversation about what takes place in Jesus' final week, especially spreads out what happens at the Last Supper. That's why we spent like 3 weeks or something like that just looking at what Jesus said and what went on between he and his disciples at the Last Supper. In the Jesus timeline, where are we right now today? In the Jesus timeline, today's text is the night before the triumphal entry. So where we are at with John 12 right here, this dinner party that is being thrown at Mary and Martha's house, this is Saturday night, just before or just as the Sabbath day is ending. So now everybody can eat, the fasting is over, and people can do stuff now. And just before Jesus jumps on a donkey and makes his way into and goes into Jerusalem. Just before this, in the timeline, we had the story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. And that was a whole big thing. That's not something that happens every day. That's not something that's definitely not a normal thing, but it drew attention. All of a sudden, everybody's looking, everybody's paying attention, everybody's amazed at what Jesus can do. And so Jesus and the disciples, they take off, they leave Bethany after raising Lazarus. And now Jesus and the disciples are back in Bethany again. Back in the town of Bethany, back at Mary and Martha's house, back again hanging out with Lazarus, back doing what Jesus does. When you look at this story, when you look at the story and you look at this evening and this dinner party and the events that are going on here, there's a certain reality that there is a lot of tension. I mean, you just try to put yourself in the midst of this, imagine yourself as a guest at this dinner party, for example, and there is an enormous amount of tension that exists and that is sitting here. It's one of these stories that often leaves us with more questions than answers to what is going on. What's the point? What is happening here? And there seems to be a sense, as readers, when we read this story, there seems to be almost a sense that we are being forced, as readers, we are being forced to figure out, who do we identify with in this story? Whose lead are we going to follow out of all the characters here? There's tension, an enormous amount of tension in the events and in this situation. Martha, as Martha is prone to do. Martha is working hard. She's scrambling around. She's prepping the meal. She's cooking. She's serving people. She's making sure everybody's comfortable, and she's probably going crazy. And even just the busyness and the busy energy of her in and of itself is probably sort of raising the tension level a little bit, just as it is. Meanwhile, Mary is doing what Mary does. You think about it, I think it's Luke chapter 10. I think it's in Luke chapter 10 that you get that story of Mary and Martha, where Martha again is running around doing a whole bunch of stuff, and here's Mary just sitting at Jesus' feet. And Jesus kind of has those little exchanges, those little words, almost rebuking Martha for being so busy. Mary is doing what Mary does. Martha's running around. Meanwhile, here's Mary hanging out with the men. Here's Mary hanging out with Jesus, listening and talking. Judas. There's tension when you look at Judas, because you can just tell Judas is just seething, absolutely seething, as he watches Mary waste expensive perfume. Not just expensive perfume, ridiculously expensive perfume. And we have to remember, it's important to remember that even though John makes a statement here in verse 6, even though John makes a statement here about who Judas is, and that Judas was basically a thief who was stealing money from the money bag, as far as anybody is concerned, Judas is still a good guy. See, that's just John just sort of inserting a little comment for background information. The people didn't really understand. Disciples didn't know that. They didn't know that yet. To them, Judas is still, he's a good guy. He's one of Jesus' disciples. He's a guy who you can trust with the money. Judas is the good guy. So let's walk through the text a second. Jesus, he's at Mary and Martha's house for a dinner party. All right, he's the Sabbath is over. He's at Mary and Martha's house, and then as he's sitting there and as they're prepping, maybe as they're waiting for dinner to be served, here comes Mary. Mary comes in. Maybe she comes out of a side room or whatever it is. She comes out with a jar, an alabaster jar, depending on some of the stories maybe you've heard in some of the other accounts of this story, even of itself in other Gospels. Mary comes out with this jar of perfume, ridiculously expensive perfume, and I always hated the name of it. You see the name? I lost it. Where is it at? Nard. Verse 3, I think verse 3. Mary took about a pint of pure nard. I'm thinking, that sounds like fat. It sounds like animal fat. Why would anybody want to go and start dumping liquefied animal fat on somebody? But that's not what it was. This was really expensive perfume. We're told that this perfume was worth, Judas says, this is worth a year's wages. Think about that a second. I'm just going to pull a number out. $80,000. Roughly $80,000. This bottle of perfume that Mary poured on Jesus' feet was worth roughly $80,000 in today's dollars. That is a ridiculous amount of money to basically just dump. And then, to make matters worse, and this is where we tend to go with it, I think we tend to put all the emphasis on how much this perfume was worth. To make matters worse, Mary then wipes up this perfume with her hair. Now, we tend to focus on how much the perfume was worth, but the big issue, the big thing that really rubs people wrong, the big issue that really causes problems for everybody here is the fact that Mary then proceeded to wipe it up with her hair, because in order to do that, that meant that she had to uncover her hair, which in that culture, in that day, at that time, in that situation, that was basically akin to her stripping down and running around the house naked. That's what it was. Now, if that's not uncomfortable, I don't know what is. It's understandable then to think that if you're a dinner guest and that's the situation, you're going to be angry. You're going to be offended. You're going to speak up. You're going to be uncomfortable. And so Judas, who's still the good guy, Judas, he protests. He objects. He's like, wait, hold on a second. There's a problem here. But he doesn't make an issue about the fact that Mary is now running around with her hair down, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but that's what it is. He takes issue with how much money Mary just wasted on the perfume. He protests. He says, you could have sold this. You could have sold this perfume and then taken that money and given it to poor people, because look around, we got all these poor people. Bethany, by the way, a little trivia note, Bible trivia note here. Bible fun fact, Bethany actually means house of the poor. All right. So the town where all of this was taking place was a town that was actually known for being full of a bunch of poor people. So it kind of makes sense. You think about all of that, and Jesus is like, look at all these poor people and look at the waste of this perfume. Take it, sell it, give the money to the poor, help them out. All these people. Judas is a good guy. He cares. He cares about other people. He's completely selfless. That's the image that you have here. And then Jesus defends Mary, which Jesus does a lot in the Gospels. If you can think back to all the other stories where Mary Magdalene comes up and all the other situations where Mary shows up, Jesus always defends her. He always backs her up. He always supports her. Jesus defends her. He says that the perfume that Mary just dumped on his feet, it was always intended for me. That's what this was for. Mary's just using the perfume the way it was intended to be used. And then he says, and what is, I think, one of the most confusing statements in the entire Bible, in verse 8, he says, you will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. And it's confusing because you think about how many times does Jesus talk about and tell people, especially rich people, sell all your possessions and give the money to the poor. How often does he talk about how important it is to take care of people who are poor, who are homeless? And now it's almost like he just kind of blows them off and says, no, I'm more important than they are. It's a weird text. It's a weird story that creates more questions than answers. But as many questions as this story raises for us, as many questions as it raises, there is absolutely no doubt when you look at it, there is no doubt that we as readers are being pushed to empathize with and to imitate Mary. That's where all of this is pushing. That's where John is pushing us. That's where he's trying to get us to go. But what exactly does that look like? What does it look like to imitate Mary? And how are we supposed to imitate Mary when Mary seems to be doing all the stuff that is so enormously irresponsible and unwise and socially reprehensible? What are we supposed to imitate here? A couple things. There's a couple things that came to my mind as I was thinking about this, and a couple things that we can touch on here this morning with how do we imitate Mary in this situation. One of the things that comes to mind when you look at this is that Mary seems to be the very first person to accept that Jesus has to die. When you look at the Gospels, Mary seems to be the very first person to accept that Jesus has to die. Every time that Jesus brings it up, every time Jesus predicts his death, every time there's something like that, the disciples, they resist, they fight, they try to protect him, they try to talk him out of it, they insist, no, we'll never let that happen. We're going to protect you, we're going to fight for you. Right up to the time when Jesus was actually arrested in the garden, the disciples were still fighting to defend him and keep him safe. Mary seems to understand. She seems to understand and she seems to get it. That's why she takes the perfume that was meant for Jesus' burial and pours it on his feet. She is preparing Jesus to die. Which then raises the question, how easy is it for you to accept Jesus' death? Which is kind of a weird question, and I get that it's a kind of a weird question because we think, well, of course we accept it. I mean, without it, then I can't be forgiven. But How often does Jesus' death, how often is that so offensive to us? I mean, there's a reason why Paul in his letters so often says that what I came preaching Christ crucified. And that is an issue. That is the hang up for the world. That is a hang up for so many people. How easy is it for us, for you, to accept Jesus' death? Because you need to accept that Jesus needed to die for you. You need to accept that you need Jesus to die for you. Because if you accept, or without accepting that Jesus needs to die for you, we are basically living under this belief that we can save ourselves. Or we're living under a belief that we're not really as sinful or really as broken or really have, our need is not really as big as what we might think or might be naturally inclined to think it is. You need Jesus to die for you. But then also, you need to accept that you are worthy of Jesus' death for you. And I'm not trying to pump this up and make everybody think that, you're just the greatest thing that ever happened or any of that kind of stuff. But it struck me just this morning that worth is not something that is inherently, or it's not something that anything inherently possesses. Worth is something that is assigned or granted to something. So here's what I mean, okay? Looking around, what do I have here? Okay, I got a pick. I'll hold up a pick, guitar pick. Okay, this thing is probably worth like 1.50 cents or something like that by itself. 1.50 pennies kind of a thing. I got this guitar pick and we say it's worth 1.50 cents. But if somebody decided for whatever reason that this guitar pick was going to be worth $1,000, now that is now what I have to pay in order to get a guitar pick. Because somebody else decided or assigned value and worth to this guitar pick. We have a hard time, I think, sometimes. Some of us have a hard time accepting that we are worthy of Jesus' death. We think, I'm not good enough to be saved. I'm not good enough to get this. I'm not good enough to be forgiven. I'm not good enough, or I've done too many bad things. I haven't been good enough in my life. We need to accept that we are worthy of Jesus' death. We need to accept that God has decided, that Jesus decided that you were worth him going to the cross. You were given value by God. God gave you worth. He decided that you were worth his death. And you think about it, that's at the heart of the gospel. That is so much that is at the heart of the gospel. That God loves you, that Jesus loves you so much that he thought that you were worth his death. And because of that, your sins are forgiven. You have salvation. You have the promise of eternal life because you need him and because you are worthy to him. So we need to accept Jesus' death. Mary accepts Jesus' death. Another thing that Mary does here, it's worth us paying attention to and listening to. Mary is willing to sacrifice her reputation in order to fully worship God, in order to fully worship Jesus. She's willing to give it all up. Throughout the Gospels, you think about Mary Magdalene throughout the Gospels and what tends to happen and the way that she is portrayed. And Mary is oftentimes throughout the Gospel, she's portrayed as being lazy. That's the Mary and Martha story from Luke 10. She's portrayed here in John 12. She's portrayed as being greedy. She's portrayed as being self-focused. She's portrayed as being foolish because she's wasting $80,000 worth of perfume. She's accused of being indecent. Tradition, and I emphasize this is tradition. Tradition states that in John 8, there's the story of a woman being caught in adultery, who's dragged out in the street to be stoned, and this is where Jesus comes, scratches a line in the sand, and says, "He who is without sin can cast the first stone." Tradition says that woman caught in adultery was Mary. Kind of makes sense considering now she's over here running around with her hair uncovered at this dinner party. Maybe there's some truth to that. I don't know, but Mary doesn't get a good rap in church history. And yet, here is a woman who is willing to put everything out there for Jesus. She's willing to set aside convention and social norms to worship. Are you holding back in your worship in some way? Are you holding back? There's no rule in the Bible, and let me be clear, there's no rule in the Bible that says that you have to raise your hands when you sing, or you have to clap, or you have to dance in the aisles. There's no rule anywhere in the Bible that says you have to do that in order to be truly worshiping. But if the reason you are not worshiping, if the reason you are not doing some of that stuff when you are worshiping is because you are afraid of what other people are going to think of you when you do it, I think Disney has some wisdom for us in that one. Disney.
Okay.
I know. You're going to hate this because I'm going to sing. Let it go. Let it go. That's as far as I'm going to go because those are the only words that I know of the song, and I'm a bad singer. If the reason you're not worshiping God that way or worshiping God fully is because you're afraid of what everybody thinks around you and is going to think about the way that you're worshiping, let it go. That's not your thing. That's not what we should be focusing on. Mary doesn't let her reputation get in the way of her worship. And we ourselves, we need to be careful about letting our concerns over our reputation get in the way of our worship. Deuteronomy 6:5. Go in the Old Testament here. Deuteronomy 6:5, and God is speaking to the Israelites, and he's saying, look, here's what I expect of you guys as my people. Here's what I expect. Here's what this looks like. Love the Lord your God. Worship me with all of your heart, with all of your, I forgot my words, all of your mind, all of your strength. There's something else there I'm missing too. God's saying, worship me with everything you have. Love me with everything you have. Don't hold anything back. I want all of it. Give it all to me. Mary doesn't hold back, and nor should we. Third thing, final thing that I'll talk about today in terms of what we can take and what we can learn, how we can imitate and follow Mary's example here in the story, is that Mary is willing to give the best that she has to draw attention to Jesus. Mary is willing to give the absolute best that she has in order to draw attention to Jesus. Again, $80,000 worth of perfume. I actually looked it up because I was curious. I Googled this week. I said, what's the most expensive perfume in the world? The most expensive perfume in the world, it's something like $1.2 million for like an ounce and a half of it, but most of that is wrapped up in the fact that it comes in a container, a thing that's made out of crystal, and it's got like 150 diamonds on it, and it's gold leafed and all. Most of what you're paying for the jar that the perfume comes in. You're not paying for the perfume itself. $80,000 solidly puts this in the top 5 most expensive perfumes in the world in terms of just the perfume itself. It's far, far, far from just your average run-of-the-mill perfume, which means that Mary sacrificed a lot for Jesus' glory here. And then you look at the reactions. You look at the reactions, especially from Judas, because Judas attempts to claim the moral high ground here, right? He says, this is outrageous. It's completely out of order. Look at this, a perfume, sell it, give the money to the poor. I think there are times when we will choose the less risky or the easier or the smaller sacrifice in order to avoid the hard things that God is actually asking of us. See, the lower risk thing, and this is where it gets kind of hard and kind of tricky. The lower risk thing might actually be a good biblical thing. I mean, it's hard to look at what Judas says here and to argue that what he is asking for and what he is demanding is wrong and unbiblical because of how many times Jesus says, take care of the poor, sell everything and take care of the poor. It's hard to argue that this is not a good thing that God doesn't want to happen, but but it might not be what God is asking of us right now in that moment, in which case it basically becomes a sin. It basically becomes a problem. It's a form of bargaining. It's almost like a form of bargaining in many ways. It's almost like if you can sit here and imagine a situation where God comes to you and says, hey, look, I want you to do this for me. Here's the thing that I want you to do. I want you to do this for me. And we might sit here and say, I don't know. That sounds really hard, and it sounds really risky, and it sounds scary, and I might get in trouble, or people are going to think ill of me, or whatever it might be. How about this? How about this, God? How about I'm going to do this other thing instead? I mean, after all, you tell us to do that thing too. So everything's good, right? Because I know I'm not doing what you want me to do, but I'm doing this thing. You told me to do that at one point. And so we're good. It all balances out. It's all even. And you can find somebody else to go do the hard thing. This past week, I was in 2 Samuel. I was reading in 2 Samuel this past week. And 2 Samuel 15 has this interesting story of Saul, King Saul. At that time, God gives Saul instructions to go and take care of this group of people over here because they attacked you. They attacked the Israelites during the Exodus, and they basically tried to wipe you out before you were able to get to the promised land, and that's a problem. And so God tells Saul, he says, Saul, go and take care of these people. And here's the thing, and this is one of the hard stories in the Old Testament. God says, wipe them out. Don't leave anybody alive. Take everybody out. Don't hang on to the cattle. Don't loot anything. Don't keep anything for yourself. You need to destroy everything. So Saul's like, okay, I can do that, God. So Saul goes off and he goes to war, and he wins easily because he's doing what God told him to do. But then Saul starts looking around and he says, they got a king, and kings are kind of important people. And I know what God said, but a king is kind of important. I'm going to at least respect the position that this person holds, and I'm going to let them live. I'm just going to take them as a permanent prisoner. And then Saul's looking around. He sees all these animals, and there's all these animals who are really, really good animals. They're perfect. They fit all the criteria that God has laid out for sacrifices, for worshiping him. And Saul says, you know what, I got a better idea. Rather than just destroying them, that'd be a terrible waste. I don't want to destroy them. I'm going to take all these ox and goats and sheep and everything else back, and we're going to sacrifice them, and we're going to use them to worship God and give them back to God. On the surface, it all sounds great. But then Samuel comes to Saul, and Samuel says to Saul, he says, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king.
Ouch.
Doing the right thing for the wrong reasons is still wrong. It's a message that we hear throughout the Old Testament prophets. It's a message that, in a sense, I think in many ways lines up with even with what you see happening between Judas and Mary here in John 12. Doing the right thing for the wrong reasons is still wrong. What is God asking of you right now? What is God asking of you? And are you going to deflect, or are you going to respond with obedience and joy, giving the absolute best that you have to offer to God for his glory? What are you going to do? Mary gave her best. Are you giving God your best as you worship him? And the tension continues to build as we move through here. Jesus is going into his final week. We know where this is going. We know how this is going to end up. Realistically, Mary has now prepared Jesus for burial. Exactly what that perfume was intended to do. Mary has now prepared Jesus for burial. We know next week, Jesus is going to jump on a donkey and he's going to go into Jerusalem, officially presenting himself finally as the Davidic king come to save God's people. We also know that dark days lie ahead. We know that Jesus is going to be betrayed. We know that he is going to be arrested and tortured. We know that he is going to be crucified. And those days and what is coming, they absolutely demand our attention and our worship and our acceptance of all that he has to offer. Let's pray.